It's well documented that the Nazis experimented on human beings during World War II. But did you know that America was experimenting on humans during the 1950s and 60s? Many projects were being carried out by the CIA and various other military departments, with the aim of controlling people's minds to alter their words and actions. One of the main projects was MKUltra, which was funded by the CIA, and we only know about it because some 20,000 documents were found to have survived after the order had been given to destroy them. Come with me now as we dive down into the secret world of Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra was the code name given to a series of experiments on human subjects, some of which were illegal. The experiments were created and carried out by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, popularly known as the CIA. They were designed to develop specific procedures, like brainwashing and psychological torture, that could be used in interrogations to break the individual and force a confession. They were also used to test certain drugs, such as LSD. The project was organized through the Office of Scientific Intelligence of the CIA and coordinated with the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. There were other drug-related experiments at the time, whose code names were Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird. These projects were officially sanctioned in 1953, scaled down in 1964, and further curtailed in 1967. They were finally halted in 1973. The program also engaged in illegal activities, including the use of US and Canadian citizens as its unwitting test subjects, which led to controversy regarding its legitimacy. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental states and brain functions. Techniques included the covert administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD and other chemicals, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal and sexual abuse, in addition to other forms of torture. The scope of Project MKUltra was broad, with activities undertaken under the guise of research at more than 80 institutions. These included colleges, universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Although top officials at these institutions were sometimes aware of the CIA's involvement, the CIA operated using front organizations. Project MKUltra was first made public in 1975 by both the Church Committee of the United States Congress and the Rockefeller Commission, Gerald Ford's United States President's Commission on CIA Activities in the United States. CIA Director Richard Helms gave the order to destroy all MKUltra files in 1973, which hampered investigative efforts. After that, the Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and the relatively small number of documents that survived Helms' destruction order. In 1977, a request made under the Freedom of Information Act uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to Project MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings later that year. Some of the surviving information regarding MKUltra was declassified in July 2001. These documents included a letter to an unidentified doctor that discussed work on 6 dogs who were forced to run, turn and stop via remote control and brain implants. According to American author Stephen Kinzer, the CIA project was a continuation of the work begun in the World War II era in Japanese facilities and Nazi concentration camps on subduing and controlling human minds. Kinzer stated that MKUltra's use of mescaline on unwitting subjects was a practice that Nazi doctors had begun in the Dachau concentration camp. Kinzer put forward evidence of the continuation of a Nazi plan, citing the CIA's secret recruitment of Nazi torturers and vivisectionists to continue experimenting on thousands of subjects. There was also evidence that Nazis were sent to Fort Detrick in Maryland to advise CIA officers about the lethal uses of sarin gas. The project began on the order of CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953, and was headed by Sidney Gottlieb. In response to allegations that the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans were using mind-controlling procedures on US prisoners of war during the Korean War, it aimed to develop mind-controlling drugs of their own for use against the Soviet bloc. The CIA wanted to use similar methods on their own prisoners, and was even interested in manipulating foreign leaders with such techniques. They were also devising several schemes to drug Fidel Castro. The CIA often carried out experiments without the knowledge or consent of the subjects. In some instances, academic research was funded through grants from CIA-front organizations, but they didn't know that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. The project attempted to produce the perfect truth drug to interrogate suspected Soviet spies during the Cold War and explore other mind-controlling possibilities. Subproject 54 was the Navy's top-secret program known as Perfect Concussion, which was supposed to use suboral frequency blasts to erase the victim's memory. This program, however, was never carried out. After the majority of MKUltra's records were destroyed in 1973 by order of CIA Director Richard Helms, it was difficult for investigators to understand the more than 150 research subprojects funded and sponsored by MKUltra and other related CIA programs. The project started during a period of what British journalist Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA when communism was at its height and the US had lost its nuclear monopoly. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief, believed that a secret agent had penetrated the organization at the highest levels. The agency spent millions of dollars in studies, examining ways to extract information from resistant subjects during interrogation and to control the mind. Some historians claimed that one goal of MKUltra and its related CIA projects was to create a Manchurian candidate, or a puppet that they could control. American historian Alfred W. McCoy claimed that the CIA attempted to focus the media's attention on these types of ridiculous programs so that the public would not notice the research's primary goal, which was effective methods of interrogation. One surviving 1955 MKUltra document gives an indication of the size and range of the program. It refers to the study of a variety of mind-altering substances described as follows. Number 1. Substances that will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. Number 2. Substances that increase the efficiency of mentation and perception. Number 3. Materials that will prevent or counteract the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Number 4. Materials that will promote the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Number 5. Materials that will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way, so they may be used for malingering, etc. Number 6. Materials that will render the induction of hypnosis easier or otherwise enhance its usefulness. Number 7. Substances that will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture and coercion during interrogation and so-called brainwashing. Number 8. Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Number 9. Physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Number 10. Substances that produce physical disablement such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. Number 11. Substances that will produce pure euphoria with no subsequent letdown. Number 12. Substances that alter personality structure in such a way that the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced. Number 13. A material that will cause mental confusion of such a type, the individual under its influence will find it difficult to maintain a fabrication under questioning. Number 14. substances that will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts. Number 15. Substances that promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. Number 16. A knockout pill which can be surreptitiously administered in drinks, food, cigarettes, or as an aerosol, etc., which will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agent types on an ad hoc basis. Number 17. A material that can be surreptitiously administered by the above routes, and which in very small amounts will make it impossible for a person to perform physical activity. The 1976 Church Committee report found that with the MK Delta program, drugs were used primarily as an aid to interrogations, but MK Ultra and MK Delta materials were also used for harassment, discrediting, or disabling purposes. In 1964, the MK Ultra program continued under a new name, MK Search. The MK Search program was divided into two projects called MK Often and MK Chickwit. Funding for MK Search began in 1965 and ended in 1971. The project was designed to find new offensive use agents, focusing on incapacitating agents. It was a joint project between the US Army Chemical Corps and the CIA's Office of Research and Development. Its purpose was to develop, test, and evaluate possibilities in the covert use of chemical, biological, and radioactive material systems and techniques of producing predictable human behavioral or physiological changes in support of highly sensitive operational requirements. By March 1971, more than 26,000 potential agents had been acquired for future screening. The CIA was also interested in bird migration patterns as a possible use for chemical and biological warfare research. This was Subproject 139, known as Bird Disease Studies. MK Often dealt with testing the potential for toxicological transmission and behavioral effects of drugs in animals and, ultimately, humans. MK Chickwit was concerned with obtaining information about new drug developments in Europe and Asia and with acquiring samples. CIA documents suggested that, as part of MK Ultra, they had investigated chemical, biological, and radiological methods of mind control. They spent an estimated $10 million or more, roughly $87.5 million at today's rates. Early CIA efforts focused on LSD-25, which later dominated many of MK Ultra's programs. The CIA wanted to determine if they could encourage Soviet spies to defect against their will, and whether the Soviets could do the same to the CIA's agents. Albert Hofmann first made LSD in 1938 from lysergic acid, a chemical derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. Hofmann discovered its hallucinogenic properties in 1943. Lysergic acid diethylamide, also known colloquially as acid, is a hallucinogenic drug. Its effects typically include altered thoughts, feelings, and awareness of one's surroundings. Many users have visual or auditory hallucinations. Dilated pupils, increased blood pressure, and increased body temperature are typical. Effects typically begin within half an hour and can last for up to 20 hours. It is used mainly as a recreational drug or for spiritual reasons. LSD does not appear to be addictive. Its frequent use can cause acute tolerance, requiring much larger doses to feel any effect. Adverse psychiatric reactions are possible, such as anxiety, paranoia, and delusions. Distressing flashbacks might occur, which is a condition known as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Death as a result of LSD overdose is virtually unknown. However, death has resulted from accidents or reckless behavior on extremely rare occasions. The effects of LSD are believed to occur as a result of alterations in the serotonin system. As little as 20 micrograms can produce a noticeable effect. In pure form, LSD is clear or white, has no smell, and is crystalline. It breaks down with exposure to ultraviolet light. As soon as Project MKUltra got underway in April 1953, their experiments included administering LSD to people with mental health conditions, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers. In other words, people who could not fight back, as one agency officer claimed. In one particular case, they administered LSD for 174 days to a person in Kentucky with a mental health condition. They also administered LSD to members of the general public, CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, and other government agents to study their reactions and behavior. LSD and several other drugs were often administered without the subject's knowledge or consent, which was a violation of the Nuremberg Code that the US had agreed to after World War II. This aimed to find drugs that would bring out deep confessions, or erase a subject's memory and program them as a robot agent. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up several brothels in San Francisco within agency safe houses to collect a selection of men who would be too embarrassed to talk about the events. The brothels were equipped with one-way mirrors, the men were given a dose of LSD, and the sessions were then filmed for later viewing. In other experiments, people were given LSD without their knowledge, and they were interrogated under bright lights. Doctors were in the background taking notes. They told the subjects they would extend their trips if they refused to reveal their secrets. The people being interrogated were agents suspected of working for the other side in the Cold War, CIA employees, and US military personnel. Long-term illnesses and several deaths resulted from this. Heroin addicts with offers of more heroin were bribed into taking LSD. Vic Lovell, a Stanford psychology graduate and an acquaintance of Richard Alpert and Allen Ginsberg, invited Ken Kesey to participate in a study at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, where he worked as a night aide. The project, which turned out to be financed by the CIA under the backing of MKUltra, studied the effects of several psychoactive drugs, particularly LSD, DMT, AMT, psilocybin, mescaline, and cocaine. The Office of Security used LSD in their interrogations, but Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who directed MKUltra, had other ideas. He believed it could also be used in covert operations. Because its effects were only temporary, he thought it could be administered to high-ranking officials, and therefore alter the course of important meetings, speeches, and the like. Since he realized there was a difference in testing the drug in a laboratory and using it in covert operations, he initiated a series of experiments where they gave LSD to people in normal settings without telling them. To begin with, everyone in technical services tried it. A typical experiment involved leaving two people in a room who observed each other for several hours whilst taking notes. As the experimentation progressed, outsiders were drugged with no explanation whatsoever, and surprise acid trips became an occupational hazard among CIA operatives. Adverse reactions often occurred. On one occasion, an operative whose morning coffee was laced with the drug became psychotic and ran across Washington, claiming he saw a monster in every car passing. An army chemist named Frank Olson, who had never taken LSD, was secretly given a dose by his CIA supervisor, which resulted in him plunging to his death from the window of a 13th-story New York City hotel 9 days later. This was claimed to be as a result of deep depression induced by the drug. The experiments continued despite this. According to Stephen Kinzer, Olson had spoken to his superiors sometime earlier, questioning the morality of the project and asking to resign from the CIA. Some subjects' participation was actually consensual. In these cases, they appeared to have been singled out for even more extreme experiments. In one case, several volunteers in Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. MKUltra's researchers later dismissed LSD as being too unpredictable in its results. They gave up on the idea that LSD was the secret that was going to unlock the universe, but claimed it still had a place in their arsenal. However, by 1962, the CIA and the Army had developed a series of super hallucinogens, such as the highly touted BZ, an odorless and bitter-tasting military incapacitating agent, which was believed to hold much greater promise as a mind control weapon. This resulted in many academics and private researchers withdrawing their support for LSD research, which became less of a priority altogether. Another technique that was tried was an injection of a barbiturate into one arm and an amphetamine into the other. The barbiturates were given first, and as soon as the person began to fall asleep, the amphetamines were then injected. At first, the person would start by babbling incoherently, but it was sometimes possible to ask them questions and get sensible and valuable answers. Other experiments involved heroin, morphine, temazepam, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. Declassified MKUltra documents indicated that they also studied hypnosis in the early 1950s. The aim of the experiments included the creation of hypnotically induced anxieties, hypnotically increasing the ability to learn and recall complex written matter, hypnotically increasing the ability to observe and recall complex arrangements of physical objects, and studying the relationship of a personality to susceptibility to hypnosis. They conducted experiments with drug-induced hypnosis and also with anterograde and retrograde amnesia whilst under the influence of such drugs. The CIA began experimenting in Canada when they recruited British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, who created the psychic driving concept, which the CIA found interesting. Cameron had been hoping to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He commuted from Albany, New York to Montreal every week to work at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University to carry out MKUltra experiments. He was paid $69,000 from 1957 to 1964, which is more than $579,000 in 2021. These were known as the Montreal experiments, and the funds were sent to Cameron by the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, a CIA front organization. It was documented that Cameron didn't know the money was provided by the CIA. In addition to LSD, Cameron experimented with various paralytic drugs and also used electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the normal power. His driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, whilst constantly playing tapes of noise or simple repetitive statements. His experiments were often carried out on patients who entered the institute for common problems, such as anxiety disorders and postnatal depression, many of whom suffered permanent effects from his actions. His treatments resulted in urinary incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their own parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. During this era, Cameron became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, as well as president of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. Cameron was also a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal from 1946 to 1947. His work was inspired by the British psychiatrist William Sargent, who worked at St Thomas's Hospital London and Belmont Hospital Sutton. Sargent was also involved in the Secret Intelligence Service and experimented on his patients without their consent, causing similar long-term damage. In the 1980s, several of Cameron's former patients sued the CIA for damages, which the Canadian news program The Fifth Estate documented. Their experiences and lawsuit were made into a 1998 television miniseries called The Sleep Room. In her book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein argues that Cameron's research and his contribution to the MKUltra project were not about mind control and brainwashing, but about designing a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources. In other words, torture. Alfred W. McCoy writes, Stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Donald O. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method. This referred to creating a state of disorientation in the subject, and then creating a scenario of self-inflicted discomfort in which the confused subject can alleviate their pain by admitting defeat. In areas of Europe and East Asia that were under American control in the early 1950s, namely Germany, Japan, and the Philippines, the CIA created secret detention centers so that the US could avoid criminal prosecution. The CIA detained people suspected of being enemy agents and other people deemed expendable to carry out various types of torture and human experimentation. The prisoners were interrogated, during which they were administered psychoactive drugs, electroshocked, and subjected to extremes of temperature and sensory isolation. The aim of this was to develop a better understanding of how to destroy and control human minds. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files to be destroyed amid a government-wide panic caused by Watergate. According to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. However, a cache of some 20,000 documents survived Helms's purge because they had been improperly stored in a financial records building and were only discovered following a Freedom of Information request in 1977. These documents were thoroughly investigated during the Senate hearings of the same year. In December 1974, in an article in the New York Times, it was alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on US citizens during the 1960s. That report prompted investigations by the United States Congress, in the form of the Church Committee, and by a commission known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into the illegal domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and intelligence-related agencies of the military. In the summer of 1975, both the Congressional Church Committee reports and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission report revealed to the public for the first time that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted experiments on both unwitting and conscious human subjects. This was part of an extensive program to determine how to influence and control human behavior through psychoactive drugs such as LSD and mescaline, and other biological and psychological means. They also revealed that at least one subject, Frank Olson, had died after the administration of LSD. Much of what the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission learned about MKUltra was contained in a report prepared by the Inspector General's office in 1963 and had survived the destruction of records ordered in 1973. However, it contained very little detail. Sidney Gottlieb, who had retired from the CIA 2 years previously and had headed MKUltra, was interviewed by the committee and claimed to have very little recollection of the activities of MKUltra. The Congressional Committee investigating the CIA research, which Senator Frank Church chaired, concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. The committee noted that the experiments sponsored by the researchers call into question the decision by the agencies not to put guidelines in place for these experiments. Following the recommendations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford issued the first executive order on intelligence activities in 1976. This prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with the informed consent, in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party, of each human subject, and in accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission. Subsequent orders by President Carter and President Reagan expanded the directive to apply to any human experimentation. In 1977, during a hearing held by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to investigate MKUltra, Admiral Stansfield Turner, the then Director of Central Intelligence, disclosed that the CIA had found a set of records consisting of about 20,000 pages. The papers had survived the 1973 destruction orders because they had been stored at a record center that was not generally used for such documents. These files dealt with the financing of MKUltra projects, but actually contained very few project details. However, much more was learned from these records than from the Inspector General's 1963 report. In 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy said, the deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. In Canada, the issue took much longer to surface, becoming widely known in 1984 on a CBC news show, The Fifth Estate. It was learned that the CIA funded Dr. Cameron's efforts, and that the Canadian government was fully aware of this, and had later provided another $500,000 in funding to carry on with the experiments. This revelation largely thwarted efforts by the victims to sue the CIA, as their US counterparts had, and the Canadian government eventually settled out of court for $100,000 to each of the 127 victims. Dr. Cameron died on September 8, 1967. He suffered a heart attack whilst he was mountain climbing with his son. None of Cameron's personal records regarding his involvement with MKUltra survived, because his family destroyed them after his death. Given the CIA's purposeful destruction of most records, its failure to follow informed consent protocols with thousands of participants, the uncontrolled nature of the experiments, and the lack of follow-up data, the full impact of MKUltra experiments, including deaths, may never be known. Several known deaths have been associated with Project MKUltra, most notably Frank Olson, a United States Army biochemist and biological weapons researcher. In November 1953, as part of a CIA experiment, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge or consent, and killed himself a week later by jumping out of a 13th-story hotel window. A CIA doctor had been assigned to monitor Olson, but he claimed to have been asleep in another bed in a New York City hotel room when Olson fell to his death. In 1953, Olson's death was described as a suicide that had occurred during a severe psychotic episode. The CIA's own internal investigation concluded that the head of MKUltra, CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb, had conducted the LSD experiment with Olson's prior knowledge. However, neither Olson nor the other men taking part in the experiment were informed of the exact nature of the drug until 20 minutes after they had taken it. The report also suggested that Gottlieb was nonetheless due a reprimand, as he had failed to consider Olson's pre-diagnosed suicidal tendencies, which the LSD might have exacerbated. The Olson family disputed the official version of events. They maintained that Frank Olson had been murdered. In the aftermath of his LSD experience, they believed that he had become a security risk who might disclose state secrets associated with highly classified CIA programs because he had personal knowledge of many of them. Shortly before his death, Frank Olson quit his position as acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Metric in Maryland, later known as Fort Detrick, because of a severe moral dilemma concerning the nature of his biological weapons research. Among Olson's concerns were the following: the development of assassination materials used by the CIA, the CIA's use of biological warfare materials in covert operations, experimentation with biological weapons in populated areas, collaboration with former scientists under Operation Paperclip, LSD mind control research, the use of psychoactive drugs during terminal interrogations under a program codenamed Project Artichoke. Later forensic evidence conflicted with the official version of events. When Olson's body was exhumed in 1994, cranial injuries indicated Olson had been knocked unconscious before going through the window. The medical examiner claimed Olson's death a homicide. In 1975, Olson's family received a $750,000 settlement from the US government, along with formal apologies from President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby. However, their apologies were limited to informed consent issues concerning Olson's ingestion of LSD. On November 28, 2012, the Olson family filed a suit for the wrongful death of Frank Olson against the US federal government. In July 2013, the case was dismissed, due in part to the 1976 settlement between the family and the government. US District Judge James Boasberg rejected the lawsuit and wrote, "While the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, the skeptical reader may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations in the family's suit, far-fetched as they may sound." A 2010 book by H.P. Albarelli Jr. alleged that the 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisoning was part of MK Delta. He claimed that Olson had an involvement in that event and that the CIA eventually murdered him. However, academic sources claim the incident was due to ergot poisoning from a local bakery. LSD, of course, is derived from the ergot fungus. The revelations about the CIA and the Army prompted a number of subjects or their survivors to file lawsuits against the federal government for conducting experiments without informed consent. Although the government aggressively and sometimes successfully sought to avoid legal liability, several plaintiffs did receive compensation either by court order, out-of-court settlement, or acts of Congress. Frank Olson's family received $750,000 by a special act of Congress. Both President Ford and CIA Director William Colby met with Olson's family to apologize publicly. Previously, the CIA and the Army had actively and successfully sought to withhold incriminating information, even as they secretly provided compensation to the families. One subject of Army drug experimentation, James Stanley, an Army sergeant, brought an important, albeit unsuccessful suit. The government argued that Stanley was barred from suing under the Ferrers Doctrine. In 1987, the Supreme Court affirmed this defense in a 5-4 decision that dismissed Stanley's case. The majority argued that a test for liability that depends on the extent to which particular suits would call into question military discipline and decision-making would itself require judicial inquiry into, and hence intrusion upon, military matters. In dissent, Justice William Brennan argued that the need to preserve military discipline should not protect the government from liability and punishment for serious violations of constitutional rights. It stated, "The medical trials at Nuremberg in 1947 deeply impressed upon the world that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. The United States Military Tribunal established the Nuremberg Code as a standard against which to judge German scientists who experimented with human subjects. In defiance of this principle, military intelligence officials began surreptitiously testing chemical and biological materials, including LSD. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing a separate dissent, stated, "No judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi officials who experimented with human subjects during the Second World War. The Nuremberg Military Tribunal's standards to judge the defendant's behavior stated that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is see that the victims are compensated as best they can be by the perpetrators." In another lawsuit, Wayne Ritchie, a former United States Marshal, after hearing about the project's existence in 1990, alleged the CIA laced his food or drink with LSD at a 1957 Christmas party. He claimed this is what caused him to attempt to commit a robbery at a bar and caused his subsequent arrest. While the government admitted it was drugging people without their consent at that time, US District Judge Marilyn Hall Patel found Ritchie could not prove he was one of the victims of MKUltra or that LSD caused his robbery attempt. The case was dismissed in 2005. The following names were some of the main protagonists who were carrying out experiments. Harold Alexander Abramson, an American physician, allergist, and pediatrician who was remembered as an early advocate of therapeutic LSD. Donald Ewan Cameron, who is known for his role in developing psychological and medical torture techniques. Sidney Gottlieb, an American chemist and spy master, best known for his involvement with the CIA's 1950s and 1960s assassination attempts and mind control program known as Project MKUltra. After retiring in 1972, Gottlieb dismissed his entire effort for the CIA's MKUltra program as useless. The CIA insists that MKUltra type experiments have been abandoned. Harry Isbell, an American pharmacologist and the Director of Research for the National Institute of Mental Health Addiction Research Center at the Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, from 1945 to 1963. Louis Jolyon West, an American psychiatrist whose work focused mainly on cases where subjects were taken to the limits of human experience. Martin Theodore Orne, a professor of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, who was well known as a researcher in hypnosis. Orne is best known as a pioneering researcher into demand characteristics, illustrating the weakness of informing participants that they are taking part in a psychology experiment and expecting them to act normally. He is also noted for his involvement with the poet Anne Sexton and with the trials of Patty Hearst and Kenneth Bianchi. And the following names are some of the people that were being experimented on. American poet Allen Ginsberg first took LSD in an experiment on Stanford University's campus, where he could listen to records of his choice. He chose Gertrude Stein readings, a Tibetan mandala, and Wagner. He said the experience resulted in a slight paranoia that hung on all my acid experiences through the mid-1960s, until I learned from meditation how to disperse that. He became an outspoken advocate for psychedelics in the 1960s, and after hearing suspicions that the experiment was CIA-funded, wrote, "Am I, Allen Ginsberg, the product of one of the CIA's lamentable, ill-advised, or triumphantly successful experiments in mind control?" Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is said to have volunteered for MKUltra experiments involving LSD and other psychedelic drugs at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park whilst he was a student at nearby Stanford University. While under the influence of LSD, Kesey's experiences inspired him to promote the drug outside the context of the MKUltra experiments, which influenced the early development of hippie culture. Robert Hunter was an American lyricist, songwriter, translator, and poet, best known for his association with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Along with Ken Kesey, Hunter was said to be an early volunteer MKUltra test subject at Stanford University. Stanford test subjects were paid to take LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, then report on their experiences. These experiences were creatively formative for Hunter. He said, "Sit back, picture yourself swooping up a shell of purple, with foam crests of crystal drops soft, nigh they fall unto the sea of morning creep very softly mist. And then sort of cascade, tinkly bell-like. Must I take you by the hand, ever so slowly type? And then conglomerate suddenly into a peal of silver, vibrant uncomprehendingly, blood-singingly, joyously resounding bells. By my faith, if this be insanity, then for the love of God permit me to remain insane." Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger alleged he had been subjected to weekly injections of LSD and subsequent testing while in prison in Atlanta in 1957. Ted Kaczynski, an American domestic terrorist known as the Unabomber, was said to be a subject of a voluntary psychological study, alleged by some sources to have been a part of MKUltra. As a sophomore of Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as a purposely brutalizing psychological experiment led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. In total, Kaczynski spent 200 hours as part of the study. Lawrence Teeter was the attorney for Sirhan Sirhan, who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, and he believed that Sirhan was operating under MKUltra mind control techniques. Nowadays, although illegal, LSD is commonly used for recreational purposes, but back in the deep dark 50s and 60s, it was being used as a weapon. Project MKUltra and all of its brother and sister programs were cruel and had no respect for human life. We sincerely hope that all of these experimental programs have now stopped, and we all have to make sure that they never happen again.